The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
I'm here to introduce my book manuscript, and it's tentatively titled Scaling the Global Supply Chains for Fast Fashion, Transnational Migrant Entrepreneurship in Guangzhou, China. And this manuscript explores migrants' experiences of global fast fashion through their engagements with what I call craft-like practices of garment mass manufacture in Guangzhou. A lot of their activities take place in very small-scale, sort of informal makeshift workshops that serve the global supply chains for fast fashion. And fast fashion, as I define it, is the speedy, just-in-time delivery of designer-inspired garments and accessories. And as an industry, it relies on the outsourcing of manufacturing and laboring capabilities of places across the global south. It emphasizes the cyclical and rapid delivery of trendy low-price clothing. And in my project, I'll show how various forms of mass production and social organizations are linked across a diversity of temporal, spatial, and subjective scales. So, and these connections, which I'll argue from a larger perspective, are forged through cross-cultural encounters, which I'll elaborate in this presentation today. So, when I first began my dissertation research back in 2010, I was really motivated with the question of why the Made in China label is often associated with low quality, low price, and even counterfeit goods. And these questions took me to this area of Guangdong in southern China, particularly in the Pearl River Delta region. And in Guangzhou, formerly known as Canton, the trading port of Canton, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours drive north of Hong Kong. And this region was one of the first special economic zones, which was designated and established as part of Deng Xiaoping's introduction of market reforms in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And this was a site for the experimentation of foreign direct investment and export-led industry. In places like Shenzhen, for example, prior to market reforms, it was nothing but a former fishing village, agricultural flatlands that were largely uninhabited or sparsely inhabited by local lineage members. And once market reforms were instituted, migrants from all different parts of China had migrated here and had built this city literally from the ground up in order to serve as one of the experimental sites of market economy. And in part of this sort of long history of industrialization and market reforms took me to this southeastern corner of Guangzhou. And today this still stands as an urban village, which is locally called a Chongzhongchun, which literally translates to a village within a city. And as you could see here, this is a very modest type of working class enclave, which is surrounded by more modern testaments to urbanization. So literally it's sort of surrounded by pressures of urbanization. And it's still held as a administrative site that is not fully rural, as you can see, but it's not fully urban either. What's happening is that lineage members still hold the user rights to this land. And what happened before Maoist collectivization was that this land was controlled largely through lineages. Lineages are sort of oftentimes organized through belief in a common ancestor or common surname. And land was largely passed down through fathers and sons. Now, after collectivization, with the introduction of market reforms, this land was decollectivized. It got redistributed back to lineage members, and they were redistributed in individual plots based on household, based on the number of members within a household. And now with pressures to urbanize, many of these user rights to the land now have to be individually negotiated with the municipal government in order for these user rights to be transferred back to the municipal Guangzhou municipal government and be considered properly urban. So this is sort of this moment of suspension that I see it. And right now it serves as a working class migrant enclave, which offers affordable housing, large-scale factory community, and a gateway for newly arrived migrants in the city of Guangzhou. As former agricultural villages, they stand in the shadow of the city. And they are the results of unbridled urbanization over the past decades. And you could see that they're physically enclosed by pressures of urbanizations into the concrete jungle. So they differ from city neighborhoods, which are considered directly state-owned land, whereas in urban villages, lineage members still retain the user rights to this land. So neighborhood communities still sort of manage and regulate what's happening in these urban villages. Oftentimes, there are migrant schools that open up. They run clinics, medical clinics for migrant communities. And they're often also policed by sort of semi-private officers that sort of manage the sanitation, the fire safety, and even traffic of what goes on within these urban villages. So within this particular garment district in Guangzhou, a number of large-scale factory fabric markets and factories have sort of mushroomed in this moment of suspension while these negotiations are taking place. A lot of the former lineage members now have become rentier class. They rent a lot of their the apartment houses they've erected to newly arrived migrants who come here to experiment in different forms of entrepreneurship and to take part in this garment or clothing industry. In this place here is the fabric market, a very sort of modern looking, very large scale fabric market that was once initially invested by collective members. And over about a decade or so, they transferred the land and the property of this market back to the municipal government. So right now it's directly owned and controlled by the municipal government. But as you can see, as you can imagine, there's been a windfall of profits that have been sort of fallen into the pockets of lineage members. But in terms of everyday life and everyday activities, they're driven by newly arrived migrants from other places of China. And we could see, if you take a walk through these urban villages, you could see residues of everyday life here. There are still ancestral temples that are still standing. And here you get sort of visual remnants of mothers kind of taking care of their children, hanging out in these ancestral temples. A lot of them are migrants from outside of this urban village. If you come here, sometimes you would see maybe a leader of a lineage or a leader of a surname within the lineage who would just come to take care of this temple or tell stories, or to invite people or tourists or other visitors here and tell stories about the history of this place. But they're largely sort of visited and inhabited by rural migrants from other parts of Guangdong in China. If you also walk around, if you sort of explore more into the interior of this urban village, you'll see sort of these avenues or these alleyways where a lot of these individual storefronts have popped up to serve the commodity chains of fast fashion. You could see here samples of fabrics being sold, various forms of accessories, the hustle and bustle of traffic coming in and out according to the cycles of fashion. And if you walk in closer behind the fabric markets, this is also a very industrialized space. And here, this is where the manufacturing, the informal sort of craft-like manufacturing takes place within these small-scale workshops. And these sort of workshops are often colloquially called 加工厂, which literally means the site of added labor. For members of this industry, it's usually referred to as a cut and sew assembly factory, where clients would, from the outside, come into these urban villages, and they are responsible of coordinating different types of materials. They bring in samples, they bring in fabric specifications, the actual fabrics, the accessories that are necessary to create a garment. And the owners of this, and then the employees that these owners hire, would be responsible only for the finishing of these garments. They would assemble these garments at small volumes of about a few hundred to 1,000 per piece. And then they would package it, and then the clients would come in, pick them up, and then take them to wholesale markets or other sort of retail outlets around the world. So many of these 加工厂 or assembly factories are owned and operated by one of the members of one of the first generation of migrant workers who had come to Shenzhen, Dongguan, Guangzhou around the 80s and 90s. And over time, they would sort of work their way up along the management hierarchy. They become managers of an assembly line, for example. They accumulate skills in garment mass manufacture. They accumulate some modest form of capital. And then they would follow maybe a family member or a village, a local villager to these urban villages, and they would rent these small, compact spaces so that they could call themselves boss or laoban. And this is what's very interesting to me, because oftentimes you often think of these sort of small workshops as very insignificant. They're very small, they're almost invisible. And so what came out from my encounters here were the following questions. And how do these small-scale informal workshops operated by migrants from Chinese countryside become global? Like, how do these seemingly out-of-the-way and insignificant sites anchor their relatively low-tech capabilities upon the high-tech, consumer-driven transnational supply chains of fast fashion? How do migrant laborers and other market participants know the conditions of their displacement? And what do these otherwise invisible spaces tell us about transnational connections in general? So there are three groups of market participants that I'm studying. One are the migrant entrepreneurs who own and operate these small-scale informal workshops. Two, the temporary migrant workers based on piece rate work of which they hire. And oftentimes this group are not the dagongmei that Punai and other labor scholars are often referred to. These are usually either very young, maybe in the early to mid teens before they're married and they follow their parents here, or they're very old, more the elderly, in their 40s and the 50s that are sort of, their bodies have sort of been sort of weird, sort of exhausted from the work that takes place in the larger, more centralized forest factories. And finally, I'm also studying, for the purpose of my presentation today, the Chinese agents and wholesalers who broker the market exchanges between the migrant entrepreneurs and migrant workers in this urban village and the transnational clients in which they serve. So part of my argument is to lay out that the migrant workers' labor in scaling the global supply chains entails working out of several contradictions. And they work within the worlds of craft and industry, the rural and the urban, formal, informal, wage work, entrepreneurship, and fashion and counterfeit. And I'll lay out the contradictions through ethnographic stories that I present here. And it's in this labor of mediating different types of the time spaces of craft, industry, rural, urban, and fashion and counterfeit that present competing desires and aspirations for the good life. And this in turn subjects them to various types of displacement and precariousness. And some of these contradictions include freedom from wage work on the one hand, entrepreneurial autonomy on the one hand, and then emplacement and feeling stuck in the factory or the workshop on the other. They also include aspirations for global travel, engagement with transnational clients on the one hand, and then exposure to exploitation on the other. And then finally, they also aspire to the fast money and participate in that on the one hand, and then participation in this hyper-competitive market for fast fashion on the other. And so in their everyday life, migrants have to work out these cultural contradictions and dynamics in order to link and scale up their entrepreneurial practices to the transnational supply chains of fast fashion. And the working out of this become discursive sites of misunderstanding, difference, and negotiation, which really color migrants' encounters with their transnational clients. And so overall, I hope that my book project will contribute to literature on informal economies, infrastructure, to show how sort of anthropological concepts such as cross-cultural encounters, contact zones, friction, can inform us about what it takes to create or forge global connections across different times and spaces. So I'm going to get into the details of craft-like modes of mass production. So as I've introduced earlier, Guangzhou's garment district sort of really mushroomed during the 1990s when longtime members of the former agricultural collectives sort of sold their user rights or began to think of their user rights as commodities and sold them to the municipal government. And then in turn renting the sort of houses to migrant workers along these, to migrant workers in order to become bosses. A lot of these commodity chains operate according to craft-like principles. As you could see, they're very small scale. The machines are very modest. They're often secondhand machines that are brought in from larger centralized factories from outside of Guangzhou. And they employ about 8 to 10 workers at a time. A lot of times workers are sort of temporarily called upon from a day at a time from the nearby bridges or nearby avenues where they're advertised based on very small sort of chalk boards that detail the specifications of the order. You know, how many orders are there? What specific fabrics are necessary to create these garments? And fabrics determine a lot of the skills that are involved in the creation of this garment, as well as the time that it takes for a worker to finish their orders and to earn their wages. This is the place where I had conducted my research here. This is owned by a migrant couple coming out from Guangxi province. And they began their lives here as wage workers in Shenzhen. And they had experimented in different types of businesses. One is in wholesaling, selling sort of small novelties, and then gradually sort of coming back into garment industry by following a family member here. In another site, you could see then different sort of parts of the supply chains being sort of broken up into these individual sites. Here, there are workers that are just responsible for snipping loose threads of jeans and packaging. Here we have a different site where migrants then are sort of piecing together these like individual commodities and placing them onto belts, which are then later sold to global chains such as Forever 21 and H&M. And if you were to become sort of like a designer here, you could do that by coming here and buying supplies and samples, bringing them to a fabric where they're sort of constructed, dyed, and threaded together. You would also buy supplies and accessories that are necessary here, pick up bolts of fabrics, and then bring them through these pedicabs to these assembly sites. And so because that they're so small scale and rely on sort of these modest secondhand machines, this sort of brings back to this return of craft-like mass manufacture that some sociologists of labor and industrialization celebrate. But what I argue here, the problem is that even though now migrants can call themselves bosses and enjoy some aspect of autonomy, the idea of labor is no longer politicized. Rather, they describe their labor as in terms of entrepreneurship, that they call themselves designers now, entrepreneurs and bosses, and that they enjoy their freedom by either denying clients by saying no to protect certain orders that come in, or and also sort of gain some social capital. Here, because of this return to craft-like principles, the idea of reputation, this masculine form of a craftsman, is now sort of being embedded in these everyday practices. But as you'll see, this type of accumulation is only, it's very limited. And so in terms of financial, even social capital, it feels as if there is an autonomy, but there's no meaningful form of accumulation that migrants then can enjoy or can stake a claim to. And so I'm going to read to you some ethnographic vignettes that illustrate the everyday life of this particular urban village. So when I came here in this garment district in 2010, Jiagongchang relied primarily on walk-in clients, both domestic and transnational, who sourced garments for overseas exports. And these clients served the commodity chains of regions across China, as well as across East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Oftentimes, factory owners like the Wangs who operate this Jiagongchang relied on a portfolio of clients coming from different areas of the world in order to minimize their risks of financial losses and clients' unreasonable demands, as well as seasonal fluctuations or market slowdowns in any one region of the world. Over time, they had learned that collaborating with multiple transnational clients required the exhausting work of switching between different production rhythms. And here I underscore the role of temporality, as is linked to labor, in migrant entrepreneurs' experiences and their encounters with their transnational clients. These paces often varied according to fast and slow, or between long, exhausting hours and no business at all. For instance, when domestic market declined during the summer months, workshops relied on production requests from Europe and North American clients who prepared for the fall season. Periods of sustained activity are often followed by long intervals of idleness or unemployment. Unexpected periods of idleness frequently became sources of financial concern for migrant entrepreneurs. Once during a week-long idle phase between orders, I suggested to Mrs. Wang that she took the time to catch up on sleep and rest. She then immediately responded and she said, "You don't know what it's like to be in our line of work. We can't take breaks because we don't know where our money will come from." Her statement thus revealed the challenges that she and her workers must face in balancing demanding work schedules during garment production hours, which consume their everyday working hour, with their concerns of earning money to cover their living costs and family expenses during idle periods. Now, the work of switching between multiple temporalities of manufacture frequently complicated collaborations with migrant entrepreneurs and their clients. This was particularly true when machines broke down, when the delivery of supplies were delayed, or when itinerant workers simply refused to show up. So the other aspect of this craft-like manufacture is that even though Bosons can call themselves sort of can claim their own autonomy, they have very little control over the workers that they employ. A lot of times workers would talk back about if there is any contestation about a particular detail, or sometimes workers just refuse to show up, or they simply just walk out in the middle of work. There was one time where there was an elderly worker, which we have often called as 朱师傅, and who came from the province of Sichuan, and he had gained a reputation for this sort of classic idea of work and labor, and everybody paid him respect within the factory. And one day he had left, he and his wife both worked in one of these workshops, and during lunch, he and his wife had stepped out to get some food. And when they returned, they found a young worker sitting in his coveted seat, in his coveted position within the small factory. And this for him was a sign of disrespect that a young worker had taken his place within the factory. And he felt disrespected and was angry and had simply taken his wife and walked out. And the migrant workers, the owner, the factory migrant couple who I became very close friends with, were disappointed that he had walked out because they relied on him to help with their order. But again, they have very little control over the employees that they employ. And so over time, they realized that they had little control of their employees, as well as little control over the temporalities of manufacture that they were engaged in. Subcontracted agents would often come, and they would, and the factory migrant owners would often have to cooperate with multiple contractors, and they would have to coordinate time-wise the multiple processes over mass production. Disputes over quality often erupted among the workers as well as with their clients. And the Wangs would often encounter clients from France or US or South Korea that made unreasonable demands. And they would, after having prepared their production, the clients would simply just refuse to pay the Wangs. Or the clients would just disappear, even though the Wangs would prepare an order. And so quality often became a site of contestations along these sort of multiple relationships across the supply chain. Sometimes even these conflicts often become productive sites in order to see then where power is being sort of located within a certain exchange. Oftentimes, because these supply chains become invisible in the sort of upstream or downstream of these supply chains, oftentimes all you see when you're working within these workshops are suggestions of other bosses along the chain. And it is along when these sort of disputes over quality erupt where you realize that your boss is accountable to another boss along the chain. And so these sort of moments of these disputes and contestations become very productive of understanding how these dynamics work. But they, at the same time, they present a lot of struggles for these migrants in order to sustain their workshops. So here's some other sort of scenes that one would find here in this urban village. This particular workshop takes place within an abandoned temple. When my friend and I came to visit, it was sort of casually rented out by a South Korean boss and had invited or hired a group of young Sichuanese migrant workers here. And you could see the sort of informal sort of setup that these workshops take place. Migrants live here in the very same sites of which they work, and they also eat and socialize here. So cooking activities, so this is both a factory and a home life. A lot of their socialization takes place. As you can see here, the proximity of which they work is so close, and long hours sort of facilitate close ties, sort of intimate relationships that kind of form and bond, even dating, romantic connections are made here. But at the same time, it's also very fluid and very precarious. Workers kind of come in and go based on the production orders. Some stay longer than others. But it is a very highly fluid and dynamic space. So now I take you to this wholesale market where the commodities that are produced in this urban village are now taken here and sold in garment wholesale markets in different places across Guangzhou. This particular wholesale market is called Shisanghang, or 13 factories. And this is the site where the British colonists, which in the years leading to the Opium War, had traded with Guangzhou merchants. And even here, you could see sort of an emblem, sort of paying heed to this old colonial trade that had taken place in this port, in the Guangzhou Treaty Port. And it's also a site of transnational trade and fast money. Here, you could see close by in other wholesale markets the density of trade and traffic that these spaces attract. And it's also a very transnational space. So each wholesale market specialize in a particular commodity. There are shoe wholesale markets, wholesale market for handbags, different types of shoes. They also serve different markets. Some are a Korean market, some being a European or a North American market. And so this sort of creates different, not only neighborhoods, but also different communities of which traders from all different parts of China and different parts of the world kind of settle and open up sort of small-scale trading to take place or to engage in the garment industry here. Some of them, as you could see, are very transnational, and they sell different types of clothing. Here is, if you walk into one of the wholesale markets, you could see the sort of, I'm sure many of you have walked into sort of markets like this, where the density of not only commodities, but people is sort of overwhelming. In this particular market as you could see here, the spatial organization of this market is key to how migrant entrepreneurs experience the contradictions. Here, the contradiction is between fashion originality and design copying. A lot of this you could see here you've got a spectrum of different trends and different designs. Some look like as if they have been copied, or they're referred to as shanzai, so sort of the gray market, the in-between space between original and copy. But what's really interesting here is that each of these stalls are nearly individually owned and operated by migrant entrepreneurs. The rents here are incredibly high. It would be over about 10,000 RMB each month to rent, which is like maybe 4 or 6 times the average monthly salary of a Guangzhou residence. And the trends of which here cycle really fairly quickly. And because of the density of which these stalls are constructed, a lot of times competing migrant entrepreneurs would claim that their competitors are copying his or her design. And so there's a fervent of competition and the sort of urgency for fast money that sort of characterize this space. You could see here the different types of clothing that are sold. And a lot of them are young women, often in their late teens, early 20s, who are coming from different parts of Guangdong or different parts of China to sort of take up this sort of entrepreneurial activity in order to be purveyors of fashion, to be part of this fashion world, and to call themselves entrepreneurs. A lot of them would have to coordinate with different materials. They would sort of scour through magazines or internet sites and then go to the urban villages of which I introduced to you and coordinate the materials, coordinate these mass manufacture in order to deliver these designs here. Now, you could see in these illustrations that the spatial organization of these floors, which is sort of the lower part of the floors, look very different from the upper parts of these floors. This looks a lot more formalized, and it looks, and a lot of these packages have higher volumes. Even the type of clothing looks very different from the clothing that's sold down here. A lot of the stalls here serve the markets in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East or different parts of China. And the competition, or the cycle of competition and the cycle of new trends in fashion, operate a lot more quickly than the ones that operate here. A lot of times, because the volumes are bigger, they're sold to outlets such as Japan, South Korea, North America, Europe, Africa, North America, and Europe. That the markets along the sort of higher upper hierarchies of the value chain sort of are reflected within the spatial organizations of this market. There's also, so this is the way I've sort of the scaling and the cycling of this fashion is a form of which the scaling of these clothing get sort of linked up to the transnational chains. Another aspect of this market that is really interesting here is that even the spaces are turned over according to the cycles of fashion. So a lot of the times the important fashion seasons happen in the fall. And so in the summer months, this market completely closes, and the building management come here to renew leases for those who lease these individual stalls. A lot of times, depending on how their business goes, a lot of the lessees would not renew their contracts, or they're forced to remodel. And a lot of this remodeling offers a type of sort of collusive exchanges with the building managers. A lot of times building managers would kind of walk through these aisles and see if there's a business that's particularly particularly doing well, then they would sort of extract fees based on electrical wires, or they would have to ask them to remodel a particular space and charge them with even nailing a nail onto the wall. And within this building, there's even a construction company that serves the sort of remodeling aspect of this economy within this building. And so the fact that there's a construction company within this building sort of shows then the type of regulation that takes place among building managers here. And in my work shows then how the cycles of fashion sort of coordinate with these collusive relationships that happen here. And a lot of it are sort of articulated in fashion languages and fashion cycles. And so the key aspect of a lot of these extractive activities, competition, has to do with charges of design copying. For those that work in these lower levels, when they talk about their labor or their entrepreneurial activities, they are much more sort of direct or honest that they use design copying in order to create their products. They don't have a lot of, because they're not educated in design background, they articulate sort of their activities by showing the processes of garment design. And their worry is basically market survival, keeping pace with the fast cycles of fashion. If you talk to bosses along these higher floors where they're more formalized boutiques, a lot of these entrepreneurs have some sort of education backgrounds. They may even hire designers in order to operate these boutiques. And they describe their work in terms of creative labor as designs, legitimate designs that are based on sort of having a feel for the market or knowing or having access to predicting future fashion trends. And so what happens here when we think about like copying fashion is that there's a real class-based of organization that is sort of marked by the spaces of which this market is organized, as well as to the temporalities of which the fashion commodities come in and out of this market space. So one female buyer who frequented this market often described confrontations that erupt when a wholesaler was fined by one of the building managers here for selling a counterfeit garment. Apparently, a pattern used by one of her garments closely resembled a design trademarked by an internationally recognized luxury brand. The wholesaler disputed this charge, claiming that her garment was an original design. The observer sort of remarked to me, of course the dispute had to do with money, kickbacks really. We as outsiders, we don't know the types of collusive relationships and business interests that are tied to the monthly collections of rent. Her reference to kickbacks implied a web of social relations that structured the way in which stalls and commercial spaces within the building were allocated and subleased. For those who regularly visited the market, disputes such as this over copy design and counterfeiting often flared up on a regular basis, and this particular altercation amassed the deepening divisions in wealth and access to real estate that characterized this commercial space. So in order to keep up with the sort of incessant movements of goods coming in and out, oftentimes the migrant entrepreneurs really have to keep up in terms of finding the hottest or predicting the hottest trends. And so a lot of this, because of business risks, they copy or they take more direct designs from those that are proven to be successful commodities that are sold on the market. If you have a sort of particular design that is like a bit too different or too creative, it would be too risky for a migrant entrepreneur who's studying or who's struggling in this market. And so this type of the dynamics of this become very contradictory, and there are different types of the cycles that are very class-based within this market, often exacerbated by the way this building is managed. For those migrant entrepreneurs that operate in these lower floors, the enormous risks entailed in running a stall often relies on the pooling of family resources in hopes of striking it rich while enjoying the independence of becoming their own boss. I've interviewed a young migrant entrepreneur by the name of Ling, who recently closed down her 5 to 7 foot stall after running a business for only about 2.5 years based on savings that she had pulled in from her family in nearby Foshan. When her wholesale business for women's beach dresses failed, she decided to take a step back from the pressures of running a stall there so she could brainstorm new business endeavors. She ultimately dreamed of resuming her business in the market to try her luck again. And oftentimes, even though the shelf life of a business in the lower floors are often about 2 to 3 years. And so this kind of is a testament to the quick turnover of the leasees that come here and the hyper competitiveness of this market. With her eyes beaming, she exclaimed that in this market, just before the 2008 market crash, some bosses were making up to 10,000 RMB a day. She said that if you can make it here, you can make volumes of money. The returns are huge. The rise of rent, coupled with widespread prevalence of copying here, ultimately undercuts the vibrancy of this market as a whole. She explained that the cost of renting stalls nearly doubled over the past 3 years, making her former business almost impossible to sustain. Since the global economic downturn in 2008, fewer foreign clients passed through these hallways, and the rising costs of cotton and other raw materials exacerbates the struggles of maintaining a stall here. As a way of evading these market risks, then, a lot of these sort of small-scale migrant entrepreneurs rely on copying, and ultimately there are fewer styles to choose from. So it undercuts the sort of a vibrancy of this market as a whole. So even though then copying is often celebrated as a way to sort of fuel the competition that drives a market, here there's a balance between copying and too much copying, which undercuts the sort of the trends and the styles that this market is able to offer. When I asked her personally whether someone had experienced copying from her, she recounted a time when a friend of hers, a wealthy local boss, operated a boutique in one of the upper floors of the market. The boss asked Ling to show this younger relative the ropes of running a fashion trade. And when Ling agreed and added that the friend's cousin added her as Ling's employee. Over the course of 6 months, the young woman learned most of Ling's business secrets, and then ultimately opened up a stall right next to hers, mirroring most of Ling's garment styles and fashion aesthetic. And then when Ling confronted this woman, she had claimed that her look was purely, of course, original. And since this young woman had claimed that she had studied fashion design before, her assertion of originality and creativity tends to sort of hold more legitimacy. Ultimately, Ling concluded, what can you do? Business is business. And by the time someone copies you, the styles would have changed anyway. And finally, another migrant entrepreneur in these lower floors admitted to having or described his work as relying on copying design in order to jumpstart his business, since design copying was so pervasive here. He said that once a business owner become privy to a certain design or style that sold well, competitors would quickly then copy that design within 2 or 3 days. They would either take an entire look and mirror or modify make very minor modifications and simply sell it as their own. By then, one could see then that several stall owners would sell almost the same design. But he said, according to his point of view, that having somebody copy your design was a testament to business success. That copying was advantageous to wholesalers because the practice of design copying signaled some form of public recognition. So in his view, success of a wholesaler secured financial freedom while eliciting acceptance and admiration from others. He then further reasoned that the preponderance of copying in this market bore witness to the fact that wholesaling within a market such as this should have a slow, reflective response to the market. The volumes of fashions rotated in and out moved too quickly to nurture and facilitate the necessary time and creative space for struggling entrepreneurs and migrant workers. And even retailers often complained that neighboring competitors would often try to attempt to copy their designs as theirs. Oftentimes, I would even overhear a young sailor comparing her clothing style with a competitor. And at one point, one wholesaler would sort of complain to a friend by saying, you know, that how competitive this market is and that how difficult it is to have a competitor take your design as theirs. In one conversation, I've heard sort of a friend relieving the stresses of her friend by saying, yes, the clothes you picked up depending on a discerning eye and having for a feel of fashion. Don't worry about it, you know, you have a good eye for design, as if creativity was endowed as a particular talent or a skill cultivated by years of learning and experience. And so in this particular site, what the contradictions that migrants would often face are the sort of blurry lines between fashion and counterfeit that I lay out here. Overall, by way of summary, as you could see here in sort of these sort of contradictions between craft industry, fashion, and counterfeit, we see these commodity chains as value chains that are anchored in different time spaces. And they're often linked with sort of different pressures of urbanization and development as a whole. And that these commodity chains, these often referred to as value chains, are dynamic. They change frequently according to the fluctuations of the market, and they're subject to larger spatial political transformations such as urbanizations and development here. So what's key because of this dynamicism is that it's very difficult to locate one or particular node of accumulation. So as you could see in the urban village that I present, it's because of the lack of control that migrant entrepreneurs can assert on the market, as well as upon their employees and the conditions of their labor. Financial accumulation of social capital is very difficult for them to pursue. Here in this market, it becomes clear then that the migrant entrepreneurs are going through some sort of what I call a treadmill effect, that these sort of cycles come in and out so quickly. They encounter building managers that extract different types of fees or rent-seeking activities, so that these quick cycles that's characteristic of fast fashion is sort of elusive to them. It's very difficult for them to accumulate any form of sort of capital from which they can establish themselves properly as entrepreneurship. Ultimately, this lies to the question of what entrepreneurship and autonomy means when there is no meaningful means of accumulation for them. One sort of classic example is that as we speak, this urban village now, of which I introduced to you in the beginning of my talk, is now the target of mass eviction. And it's sort of this ripple effect from the mass evictions that we had seen in Beijing back in November. And there's sort of, right now in this urban village, at least 56 small garment factories, the jiagongchang that I introduced here, have been ordered to shut down based on fire safety and hazard. As of April 14th, over the weekend, there's been some unrest and protest because of these evictions. And what's really interesting here is that because lineage politics play a more important role in southern China and places like Guangzhou than in Beijing, it's interesting to see how the politics of urbanization and land transfer rights will be played out, considering that lineage collectives has such a powerful hold over the administration of this land. We still don't know how this will play out, but in this moment, at the one hand, the sort of suspension of negotiation has opened up this informal economy. And in this wholesale market, it becomes clear where rent-seeking activities and extraction takes place. And here, I sort of underlie the importance of studying fashion in terms of the cyclical type of coming in and out, where the timing of a market becomes sort of this timing of governance and rent extraction that migrants often encounter. So with that, I guess I'll close my presentation and open it up for questions.